Welcome to the Tank Podcast. In this week's episode, taken from the Tank archives, Stuart Jeffries considers Oliviero Toscani's subversive advertising campaigns for Benetton in the 1980s and 1990s.
It was a pleasure to read Property Journal, and I liked that it had such a simple and generative premise and that it spelled out really early in the first pages. So it's a daily log of conversations about real estate property and housing between the end of 2021 and the end of 2022. I found that it really located it in place as well as in time because it was so tied to your life. I wanted to ask how you settled on this formal strategy.
I guess when I was thinking of the idea, I didn't necessarily see it as like a formal strategy maybe. I thought of it like as like an activity, and in some ways maybe I thought of it more as like a kind of like durational thing that I would like take on, like in a sense kind of like a performance or something, but it's not a performance. And I think why I came to this idea of like, okay, I should write every day about this topic and record these conversations about real estate and property and housing, is just because it came up so much all the time. Where I live in Toronto, it's like a constant topic of conversation, and people have different reactions to it because it's such a constant topic. People are sick of talking about it, but at the same time, like they kind of can't stop themselves from doing it, because it is so prevalent and like painful and in some ways kind of shocking, like the conditions that we're forced to live in, so that it's kind of like, yeah, you're fascinated by it, And so I was working towards an exhibition which I knew was going to kind of be about these themes, and I was making this show at this time when my parents were preparing to retire and move out of this house that I grew up in Calgary. We lived there for like most of my life, and before that we were in Hong Kong, and they were preparing to sell this house, and it was this really big, undertaking, right? It's like this big milestone in my parents' life, and at the same time my sister had just purchased another house in Toronto where I live, and she was renovating it with the goal of moving my parents into it so that they could come and live in Toronto with us, because otherwise it's not impossible, but would be very challenging for them to afford to live in Toronto, like as retired people. So all of this was kind of like starting to happen when I started thinking about the journal, and so, yeah, I guess I thought like, okay, like there's something about how this topic comes up every day, and I really enjoy reading journals and diaries. Like, it's I find it so nice, just that type of writing that's very raw, and so that's how I kind of came to it. And I think in the beginning I didn't think it was going to be a book necessarily. Like I thought it was going to be more, and it in the exhibition it did have, it kind of exists in different formats. There's like a book version, and then there's this calendar version, which is every entry is on one page, and then in the exhibition the pages of these calendars were ripped off and thrown on the floor. So in the exhibition, and this is how I originally imagined it, I didn't necessarily think people were going to read it like from front to back, I thought it was more going to be like they're going to enter this kind of installation and then get a kind of smattering of entries. One of the earlier ideas was like, and I was trying to figure out for a long time, but I was like, oh, maybe I like print out every entry and then have this like grid on the wall, and it's like this wild grid and no one can, you can't actually read it. There was kind of this feeling of like, maybe it's not important that it's actually read. It can kind of just be this overwhelming like visual kind of project or something. And but then over time it developed into this book. So So yeah, maybe there's something there about how I didn't really necessarily intend it to be something, when I first started keeping it, that was going to be like front to back. People are going to read this,
It's really interesting to hear how you imagined it as something visual or spatial in a gallery. And in fact, the design still has this checkerboard kind of, black and white, and then white and black kind of quality that I think means that you could very well like dip into it at different points. Like you could visit it, I think as you did at the reading, looking for the day of the year that corresponds to, the day of picking up the book. I think that this, I don't know, made me very invested in the story, and it was also nice to see that update at the end of the book that I guess reflects on the events of the year with distance, and it kind of invites like this idea of like, now what's happened? Like what's like kind of the next chapter? I mean, it is interesting, I guess, because it's a product and a statement of how embedded property is in life, how totally inescapable housing and shelter is as a human need, and also what a big determinant of human lives property is. Like, I mean, it can determine, like, if a couple can be together, it can determine, like if a family can be together, but it also might mean that a family, could fall apart under the kind of pressure of conditions that I thought that it was a very, generative premise. I guess what you say also makes me reflect on how I constructed World of Interiors. Kind of, it came out in the same, or like, I mean, I guess there's this overlap in the periods kind of covered. So it came out a few years ago now, and it was commissioned before the pandemic and then written to some degree during the pandemic. So a pivotal point in my life, I guess, I was reflecting on the many, many long years of different kinds of, I guess, student and single person and somewhat precarious housing that I had been through, beginning with migrating to, Germany and then Australia with my parents, and continuing through, I guess, these undergraduate and like postgraduate years living in different cities. It was the end, I guess, really, of this phase in my life. But I could also see that this idea that one's life and one's housing journey would be linear and aspirational was not kind of... I mean, it also was happening for, like, people that I know, but it also absolutely wasn't happening for people that I know. And then it felt that this would become, more and more stark kind of over time. This was like a kind of pandemic tipping point where like a lot of things became very stark, and where a lot of people's lives were set on, one trajectory or another.
I think it's really interesting how you describe that kind of feeling of ambivalence, I think, of like maybe the sense of like maybe having achieved some kind of like housing security, which, is supposed to be these steps that you go through life, these linear kind of like goals that you reach. And yeah, like you were saying, you start as a baby and you live in your parents' house, and then you move out of your parents' house and you become a student and you live in university dorms or whatever, and you have shared housing, and then you find a partner, and then you get married, and then you own a house and you have kids, and like that's kind of, the stages that you're supposed to go through, and like that doesn't happen for lots of people. But I guess that contradiction, like maybe there's something that you said that reminded me of like some kind of sense of like contradiction or something that we live in, where it's like, I guess I have, like, maybe I have achieved this, but also it can be taken away at any point, like, and how much that's tied with relationships. Like, if you break up with your partner, then do you still have housing, you know, or like, what happens if your parents die, or all of these different things. And I was thinking of how in the first essay in your book, which is called London Poverty, like poverty in brackets, and you talk about this magazine, World of Interiors, and this glossy magazine that was started by Condé Nast, and it's about interiors, it's about furniture and interior design and stuff. And then you write about how, like, Condé Nast, I thought it was really interesting, like Condé Nast imagined it as a wait, sorry, was the guy's name Condé Nast, or was it something else Nast?
The media empire originator was literally called Condé Nast. He bought World of Interiors which was originally started as an independent publication by Min Hog, but it entered his portfolio. And she kept being the editor, but he became the publisher. Yeah. So, and his name was Condé Nast.
Yeah, it's like, is that a real guy's name? Okay, yeah. And then you have this quote about how he says that it's like, or his goal was to make these class publications, and they weren't meant to. He recognized that, and like the success. This is a quote, like, lay in conspiring not only to get all their readers from one particular class to which the magazine is dedicated, but to rigorously exclude all others. And I was just thinking about that, and it's like, how does that make sense? Because if it's a magazine, like a popular magazine that's available in any store, like anyone can read it, and that's your experience of it, you know? You reading this glossy magazine is like, I don't mean to say like you're not of that class. I'm not making that judgment. But I don't think it's intended for you, or you don't read it as like the intended reader, you know, like maybe this idea of fascination, like I think in your essay you talk a little bit about being fascinated with it. And I guess I was wondering, like, you know, how does this, like, this kind of exclusion idea where it's like the magazine is meant to exclude you, but then at the same time anyone can read it, and in some ways it's like it's also meant to attract the people that it excludes, you know. And I guess I was just wondering about that, and like this idea of like how we relate to property, you know, and like this feeling of constantly kind of being kept out of like what we actually need, but then at the same time like this very fact of scarcity is what makes us like want it more. And maybe that's something I read about in Property Journal, like someone was saying that there's like this feeling of longing throughout, where there's different entries where I talk about like walking through neighborhoods, like kind of nice neighborhoods, and like looking into people's homes. And I still do this constantly, you know, like I love walking around in the evening and like looking through people's windows and being like, oh, look, like what's in, you know, and just kind of imagining their lives. And maybe something about that feeling of like longing and exclusion. And I was wondering if you had anything to say about that.
After writing World of Interiors, I did a commissioned text on public libraries, but also the origins of philanthropy. And I came across some academics who put forward philanthropy in the sense that we know it today, like sort of support of like arts and culture and sort of I don't know, like certain institutions, like maybe libraries or museums. They described it as a product of 19th century industrial capitalism and like the struggle between capital and labor. I guess they associated it with the emergence of like the new urban wealthy and the new urban poor, because you know cities kind of hadn't really existed in the way that we know them now before the 19th century. I guess that I was really struck by these descriptions of a transition from periodicals that were more like, you know, for like the association of like farmers, or like for like the association of like sort of, I don't know, like metal workers, or like, you know, connected to like guilds or professions, a shift from the kind of publication that would speak to people united by like what they do for work, to speaking to, I guess, yeah, like a class of people who want to, you know, dress in a certain way, decorate their house in a certain way, entertain like other wealthy people in a certain way. And I was really struck by, I think Carl Chaker says, you know, or who but your peers can tell you, you know, what's desirable, and like, you know, what you should wear, and like what you should serve, like what you should want, and like what you should buy, given that for the first time all of these things are available on the market that were never available on the market before, because like you know, because of like the emergence, I guess, of like global industrial capitalism. And so I think now when I think about magazines, I just think, oh, like it makes so much sense, because you know, like it makes sense with like department stores, it makes sense with like you know, commodities. And then it also makes sense with inequality, because I guess you have the people who can enjoy those things, and like you have, you know, the people who can't enjoy those things, and like maybe commodities will sort of cheapen, and then even someone who's not wealthy can afford, you know, like an iPhone, or like a lipstick, or like even like a handbag, but they can't afford, you know, like an apartment or like you know, somewhere sort of like central and like kind of like attractive and like desirable, like to live, something that is going to be this like object of like envy and spectacle. It is striking to hear a description of Property Journal as full of longing. Like in hindsight, it is full of longing, but I also kind of think of it as full of anxiety. And I'm really struck by the scene when there's finally the reveal of like the new home, like the newly renovated home, and then I'll try to quote like the pale oak hardwood floors, and like the sort of like soft wool carpet, and like all of these things. But then it's really suffused with anxiety and tension, and like this feeling that you know, all of this could be ruined. Maybe it is a feeling that like this could also be taken away, or like the, you know, something kind of something bad could happen. In fact, you write about like feeling protective and kind of worried about, I don't know, like I guess like the sort of completion or like realization of this project, this like subject of like longing.
It's great that you identified that entry, which is that the kind of me going to my sister's like newly renovated home that has been this whole subject of drama for like the whole year basically that the journal's kept, because it's true, when it was done, I didn't feel, and I don't even know necessarily if like my family members felt, like I don't want to speak for them, but that it was like this sense of like celebration necessarily, you know. There was a sense of completion, but the idea of like all of these very nice, like nicely appointed details, and like this beautiful oak floor, like I just remember going over there and like thinking, oh my god, this oak floor, like how is it gonna stay clean? Like I was just, you know, I felt so worried about that. And it sounds ridiculous, but I think because I know, like, or had a kind of a sense of how much it cost, and of course because that whole year I had been beside my sister as she and her partner, and like with my parents, that were like going through this like extremely, you know, like you know, people talk about renovations all the time, and there's another entry in the journal about, that's a joke about how like in order to survive academia, you should stop talking to someone if anyone brings up their home renovation. Like, just stop talking to them. Yeah. Anyway, so like the dramas of home renovation, whatever, but I also knew like how taxing and like stressful it was for my sister and her partner, like how much they had to work to afford it, how much they had to work to try to save money on it, you know, like all of these different things that they took on, all the pressure that they feel, like financial pressure. And so, yeah, when I looked at the oak floors, it was like the oak floors like embodied all of those pressures and strains and stuff, you know, and it's just like, oh my God, like they're gonna get ruined. Like, how can it be, you know, these things, how can it be that like whatever this like material can stay looking like this? And I don't know, this is maybe completely ridiculous, but like I'm surprised even now when I go over to the house and I'm like, oh, the floors still look really good. Like I guess that's like the nature of like having something expensive, you know. But I think like something my partner said about the book, which I found very helpful to think about, like the property journal, is that they were like, it is also a journal of like class contact within families and like the difference between my financial position and where my sister is and also where my parents are, you know. It's not uniform, and that's a real source of tension, and like you mentioned earlier, like can be something that really like strains relationships, and I think that's, yeah, maybe something that I don't know, I still don't really know how to kind of grasp it, you know. I think it's like a central kind of thing in my life that I'm constantly like thinking about and just trying to like, and maybe anticipate, and so there's this feeling also of like the future, and like maybe that sense of anxiety is also like the future was it gonna bring, you know, because it, yeah, like it's so there's so many things about like money that's very unstable, you know, and yeah, and that's part of the anxiety of the book too.
I think that's something that's really effective in the book is the use of dollar amounts. I feel like it really connects the reader in the text because, you know, like everybody spends money like every day. Like it's kind of a fact of life. I mean, it really captured the sort of like prosaic and like everyday nature of, I guess, property relations. And I think that it did kind of force this kind of confrontation with like class difference, I guess. Yeah, like within families as well as between families. I mean, I guess when I was writing my book, I was thinking about how Britain is so different from, I guess, the Australian context, like where I grew up, and like, I guess the Canadian context where you grew up, because, you know, for what it's worth, like class is something that people are conscious of, very conscious of, like painfully conscious of in Britain. And the hiding and I guess disavowing of it is like, you know, like I feel like that's such a big part of life because, you know, class is such a big part of life, and then it feels in some ways more taken for granted that a lot of things about your life. I mean, I think that in Australia, and I don't know if it's the same in Canada, but I feel like, well, I guess like in basic ways, like we both come from these sort of like settler colonies, like these sort of like new world places that are premised on the, you know, like dubious kind of ideas of, I guess, like discovery and kind of new possibilities and like new societies that are somehow supposedly different from, you know, the class system in Britain, the like feudal, like kind of like aristocratic system in Britain. You know, like I doubt if that's like really true, like in like Australia or Canada or the United States. But there also are things in London that are just so galling and like that kind of feel maybe uniquely like British. I don't know what you think about that. I thought that it was an incredibly Canadian book. Did you?
Yeah. Well, no, I think I know what you're saying. I think if there is, because I've spent time in the UK, but I don't totally get it. So I'm curious if you have an example of like the kind of awareness of like British or like class awareness of in Britain that is specifically like what you're saying, like what something that's more, yeah, like you were saying, it's like galling in London. Like, what is that specifically, or if there's an example? Because I can't really imagine it. Like, maybe I just haven't totally encountered it in when I've been in the UK.
Sometimes my partner and I talk about how in either Germany or Australia, there isn't really an equivalent of Oxbridge. They're sort of aren't like ultra specific, like ultra elite universities in the same way. And, you know, there might be sort of prestige connected to, you know, a particular program, or there might be it would operate in like a slightly different way if we sort of like purely talk about universities. I mean, something else that doesn't exist is like this discourse around accents and like regions of like Britain. This is something that you know, that was completely foreign to me when I moved to London. And then I realized that it's massively important to, you know, English people.
I think that, okay, I guess like one funny thing that a British person told me once about Canada was, she was, you know, we were talking about like, yeah, she had spent some time in Canada, and she was like, Canada is like frozen in like its idea of what it thinks Britishness is, because there is this like strong kind of Anglophilia in Canada of like aspiring to be like the you know, the progenitors, the settlers, the originals. I mean, there's British and French settlers, like not to erase the French, but she was like saying like it's like this like copy, it's like a copy of what Canadians like copy what they think Britain is, and then make it even more stuffy and like more frozen and like more dry and like kind of inert or something, you know. And I was like, that's so funny, because I think as a Canadian, like I do feel that there's this kind of like culture that's like so uptight or something. I don't know, I don't want to speak in these kind of like general terms, but I do think the book is, I mean, you know, it is very much about Canada, and it is very much about Canada as a settler colony, as a place that's founded on genocide, and a place that is about extraction of profit from land. Like, that is really the project of settler colonialism, right? Like, obviously it's not about bringing values to the new world or whatever, like people, you know, all of that stuff is like obviously moot, but it really is about like taking the land and like making money from like the sale of the land and divvying it up and like making, you know, speculating on the land, on the value of the land. So I think, you know, and maybe when I started keeping the journal, I wasn't necessarily thinking about that, but as I was writing it, that, you know, some things, like I was reading some articles and stuff, and I was like, oh yeah, this is really what has created the situation in Canada, where for some reason rent and like house prices are so high in this country that's so big and actually has so much space, you know, in terms of like, you know, it's not like Hong Kong where I was born, which is, of course, there's limited space, you know, it's an island. It's a very small island. And I think that's part of why it's people in, you know, or why myself and like some of my friends in Canada feel so kind of like disturbed by the situation. Is like Canada's a small country with small country in terms of population, but it has a vast, enormous landmass, and then for some reason the housing market is like completely bonkers. and none of that really squares, it doesn't really make sense. And I think that's why, it feels so disturbing. And something I was thinking about, like, in reading World of Interiors and thinking about this topic was, like, this feeling of loneliness. And I don't know if it's something that you explicitly say, but it is kind of a feeling that I got from reading, like, the first essay, and I think even at different points in the book, where it's just this, it's a feeling that comes up. And I was thinking about that in relation to, like, these settler colonial countries like Canada and Australia, and even here in the US where I am now, it's like there's so much loneliness in North, I don't know, I don't want to say it again in such general terms, but there's just so much loneliness in, like, the way these societies are structured, where everybody has, like, or the aspiration is to have a single family home, and then, and then that's it, and you live by yourself, and then that's it. And I guess I was wondering about that, like, and maybe how, if that's a feeling that you were thinking about as you're writing your book, and maybe just to bring in, like, something about how you wrote it. So there's essays, and then there's also poems, which are kind of, well, but you can speak to it more, but they're created through collage and, like, bringing in language from other sources. And I guess maybe putting those things side by side is, like, what is there something about this feeling of, like, loneliness, and then also this feeling, and then this technique of using collage and, like, having different sources come into your writing?
I think that when I was rereading the book, maybe particularly this essay, I was thinking about the loneliness that can happen inside homes, as well as, because everyone sort of like, aspirationally lives separately, even though, like, in fact, like, that's not always possible. I had actually forgotten how I write about television and watching all this television as a child, and how, I guess, this maybe connects to, reading these books from the library, and, like, reading these magazines, and living in some ways in quite a, fantasy, like, fictive world. I mean, I think that this speaks to, I mean, like, I guess in a way, like, it's extended into, like, my adult life and art practice, because I collage so much. It's much more often that I'm creating poetry using, something from, like found material than something that I write myself. I mean, maybe it speaks to the ways in which we can help one another kind of overcome loneliness, but like people can also make other people feel very lonely, and also people can, I guess I was thinking about transformation and how an individual's life can transform again and again, and sort of there can be these acts of, I guess, like, creation and, like, decreation of, like, kind of, like, homes and families and lives. And then I was also thinking about how relationships between people can transform, and their relations to power and one another can transform. Like, I was really struck by this section of Property Journal where you talk about a radio interview of a couple who get evicted from their house on Vancouver Island, and they have this baby. They decide to move to Nova Scotia, and I guess go somewhere rural, and, like, also have, like, land as well as a house. And then when they finally find a house, like, other people are living in it, and then they have them evicted. And so, as you write, like, the evicted become evictors because they've lost their own housing. And then, mystifyingly, they kind of give this quote to the radio, and then they say something like, I guess they're asked, what do you think about people in Nova Scotia being worried about people coming in from other parts of the country, buying up their houses and land? And then the couple said, I hope they can think of us think of all of us as Canadians in it together, and like the housing crisis is everywhere. I thought that was amazing. I also thought that there was an amazing implicit transformation in another part of the book, where you write about how someone you know is, I think, is it working on a book about land trusts? Or like she sort of describes how land trusts started in the 70s, 80s, and even 90s, are now well established with large land holdings because of the price of land at that time, and that newer ones really struggle. And then she said that a major challenge for people involved in land trusts is that at the beginning they were activists and tenant organizers, and then I guess with the like transformations of like kind of all relations, they find themselves becoming property developers and like property managers, which is not what they, it's not what they set out to do. Do you want to comment on like the place of like, I guess, these transformations and like reconfigurations in the book?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, it's really interesting to hear you talking about transformation in World of Interiors, because that is, just thinking of like the last sections, like the death section and like flowers and horses and stuff. And I think that's what I really found so moving about the book, is like this ending that is so, it's just a very powerful ending. So I just wanted to say that. In terms of the transfer, I mean, I was thinking when you were talking about transformation, and then these examples that you bring up of people who started out being evicted and then become landlords and evict other people, and other people who are trying to form these community land trusts to take land off the market and create community benefit for people, and then in turn become kind of part of the market in some ways, or can't escape the kind of entanglements with it. I was thinking about this quote that you have in the opening essay about Anna Nicole Smith and her story, and I watched the Anna Nicole Smith TV show as well, and I really I don't know if loved it is the right word, but I thought it was very moving. I found it, I really she was this very how do you say it, just empathetic character or something in that TV show. But in that section you talk about, there's this quote that I think you quote from someone else about how poverty isn't something, people talk about poverty as if it's a place, as if poverty is something you can escape from, you can leave poverty, but that's not true. Poverty is a legacy. And I was thinking maybe about the lack of transformational potential in that statement, right? It's a legacy that you can't escape from, and that there, I think maybe what capitalism tries to tell us is that, you can transform it. You can escape, you can leave, you can kind of, just cut off your ties with poverty or something, but there's something there that you actually can't, this idea of legacy and inheritance, and maybe that's present in both of our books, where there's kind of trying to deal with all of these different time scales, the time scale of my life in relation to the time scale of whatever, Canada is a nation state or something, or all of these different time scales, and this idea of not being able to escape. And I wonder about that in relation to transformation, because I really do believe in transformative potential, and just in the sense in World of Interiors, where it's death is the final thing. In all of our lives we go through this transformation, which is that we die and there's no escape from it, and that's a really important part of life. But at the same time we live in these societal structures where it's we have these legacies and inheritances that feel very impossible to transform sometimes. But then now I'm thinking also of like the Mao quote about how everything is in like ceaseless contradiction and transformation. So yeah, I don't totally know how to square all of that, you know.
I thought of another part of your book, I guess, from the very beginning, about this billionaire who doesn't have any training in architecture and who wants to donate 200 million toward the building of a student residence on the condition that they build what he's designed, which is, it's like a 9-story structure that has 2 entrances and like 94% of the rooms don't have any like windows to the outside, and like instead there's like light fixtures. I mean, I kind of started to think about this in relation to what you were saying about like land extraction and like profit extraction, like you know, in Canada, and just kind of there's this kind of almost mystical capitalist idea that like anything can be like transformed into anything else. And another commissioned text that I did after World of Interiors was about plastics, like the history of plastics, and this idea at the beginning that they just represent pure transformative potential, and that, you know, anything can be made into anything. And I guess, I mean, I became interested in how plastic is like the basis of like celluloid film, and it's like kind of the basis of, you know, reality can be turned into like illusion can be turned into reality. At the same time, I just felt, you know, like it was the COVID lockdowns, like I felt incredibly conscious of aging, death, and I guess as I write about, and as you also write about, you know, we were writing at a point in our lives when many of our friends or family members were, you know, having babies and like kind of starting, you know, like another phase of life, but also like another cycle of life, like, you know, creating like another person who's going to live and die, something that I found on my mind a lot. I mean, it is, I guess, just the political question as well as like the personal kind of question, like up to what point do we accept the limits of sort of what there is, and inside that, like where is that kind of, as Mal might say, like kind of like contradiction in itself that means that it can be transformed completely from what it is into something different. The ending of your book takes us into April 2024, and then you write about the war on Gaza and, you know, this war in relation to land and property. And you also write about watching a documentary about, you know, indigenous resistance against this kind of oil and gas extraction from, you know, their unceded land. Do you think that the social transformation, you know, that kind of maybe imagines is coming? Is it going to come from, I guess, maybe like a struggle over land, as political movements have often come from before?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my answer to that question would be like, I guess I feel like, you know, just even in the last few days with like the fires in Los Angeles, and like even just the beginning to this year, and like, yeah, the continued genocide in Gaza, and the complete kind of disavowal and indifference, right, from like whatever, our institutions, and like honestly most people, I find very depressing. And when I was writing that afterward, like in April 2024, I guess what I was also thinking about was like, after having finished the journal and kind of like reckoning with like, okay, this is the journal that exists from this year, and 2022 was like a really challenging year for me, And I think after reading it, I was like, oh my God, like it's so depressed in this sense of like, there's this kind of passivity of like recording everything. But then I guess I was longing earlier this year in this moment to have something else in the journal, like to have some other type of feeling in it, right? Beyond just like, this is the state of things and like it really sucks. And so in the afterword, I write about ghosts and I write about haunting and yeah, I write about resistance, and it felt really important to have that in the book as well. But in terms of like whether or not I think something is coming, like, yeah, I really don't know. I honestly feel really is scared of what's of the future in some ways, and maybe it comes back to this feeling of anxiety, but I feel like the anxiety now is like less about my own kind of like, or what's happening in my family, although that's part of it, but just kind of like what is happening on like a societal, the transformation that we're talking about, like what is, I don't know, I don't feel very optimistic about it, but I do agree with what you said, that like so much struggle comes from land, and like that's such a key part of it, and this idea of like solidarity between people, like between tenants, or like between people who like we all find ourselves in the same situation, I think is something that's really important. I'll just say that. I don't want to, I don't want to say, I just feel like I don't know how to answer in like I don't even want to use the words hope and hopeless, but there's, but I feel very, just the kind of insane extraction of like every part of our lives, I feel very strongly, and I think that's something that was happening in 22, like you were saying at the beginning of the interview, like COVID, like created these situations that set us on different paths, and that was starting to ramp up in 2022, and now we find ourselves like 2025, and it's like, oh my God, like, There's this scapegoating of immigrants, obviously, and of racialized people in housing in Canada, and specifically now it's a lot of scapegoating of international students. So, what the Liberal government is doing, and Trudeau before he stepped down is like targeting these international students and denying them work permits. And so people are fighting back against that, but there's kind of this like, incoming, maybe, there's going to be this mass deportation basically of like international students from Canada. And previous to this, they've been like used to get money basically by the universities, right? They're charged like these enormous tuition rates and stuff. But on one hand, there's this like scapegoating of racialized people. And then I guess the part for me that I find like always kind of like not confusing, because it is also easy to understand in some ways, it's just like this very strong like conservative tendency within Chinese communities of targeting unhoused people, like encouraging developments in Chinatown, like not fighting back against developments in Chinatown. And so I think that's always something that is just like a struggle in Chinatown organizing, is like you're up against a community that in some ways can be very conservative. There's just this like hatred of immigrants and of migrants, and of course of the poor too. And I don't know how, I was wondering what you think about that in relation to housing, like why, I don't know if there's a why in there, but yeah.
I mean, I think that it's going in very similar ways in Sydney and Melbourne with I don't know, like, I mean, I guess that the universities' business models have relied on this massive extraction from international students who at the same time they're sort of deprived of different like work and housing rights and like different like welfare rights, and they're clearly only wanted for like this one economic reason. I don't know, like this becomes fodder for like a nativist, populist kind of right that's emerging in many countries. And it's also a challenge for the left. Like, I think it's a challenge for the mainstream parties to offer a narrative that is compelling to Chinatowns like all over the world who kind of aren't spoken to, like, by, you know, the electoral left, by kind of the I don't know, but by like the far left, or like by you know, trade unions or like student unions who you would kind of hope would like kind of organize like kind of around like these unmet needs. I mean, I think that there's now this unease that I guess like surrounds like Chinese people, also because of these geopolitical like reasons, like trade war with China and
Chinese spies and Chinese weather balloons, like or something.
Yes. I mean, I think that like a wave of consciousness around this around like the COVID pandemic also led me to write what I did, but I also feel quite pessimistic about how things have gone since, I guess, the writing and publication of the book, because it doesn't really feel I don't know, like things like the LA fires like don't sort of point toward like things going in like a more positive direction, like sort of one that I guess would suggest like the ability to like cohere around sort of what you described, like sort of you know, shared experiences of, I guess, unmet needs, like both like material ones and like social and emotional ones.
There's this line from one of your poems in the book, which is and the limitless human capacity for tedium and abuse, and it's the last line of this poem. And anyway, maybe in the magazine they can like have the whole poem or something, but yeah, it's always, when I first read it, I was like, whoa, and it just really stuck with me, you know, because it's so true. And while it's so true in this extremely negative way, I also found it like maybe speaking to like this idea of endurance, and like how people, like just as this enormous category, are able to survive so much, and this idea of survival that comes up, you know, a lot in the writing. And I was just wondering if you remember where that line came from, and maybe if you could speak to a bit more. Like, in some ways I think my book is a lot about tedium, you know, and yeah, I guess what I'm trying to express is that I also found something, maybe I found something very true in it, and I guess in that truth something that is not positive, but just like true, you know, and the kind of like integrity of that.
This is a good place to end the conversation, because it is kind of so like in a way, like it is sort of so difficult to kind of look at the world and be like, things are getting better, like they're going to like you know that they're going to be different. I mean, I guess what we've been writing and talking about is how you know, we inherit like what there is, and that sort of you know, that's just it. Like, we're not born into like utopia, and like we don't make our lives there. I mean, I think that, if I'm not wrong, the line might be lifted from a magazine piece about Marguerite Duras, this I guess like post-colonial French writer, like a troubled woman, like sort of someone who could be destructive and who struggled with alcoholism and who I guess was also was like a celebrated writer and was a filmmaker of I guess some films that were sort of like very experimental, durational, and that sort of pushed the limits of things like boredom and that I think in a funny way, like I don't know if it's like I think that there is something like ironically affirmative about it. Like there is sort of something ironically affirmative about like now I'm reflecting on like Property Journal, and it's a document of this sort of circular, cyclical, and sort of sometimes you like for example these like sort of recurring unsuccessful co-op applications, or like you know these sort of I don't know, I think that it was very effective at like capturing the sort of like human efforts often are futile. I think that like we should we should never forget that's like a big part of the human experience. I think it actually is a big part of what we share, and I guess it's it's a joke, but it's also kind of it's kind of a truth. I think that it makes it a lot easier to bear one another, which you know like Property Journal also you kind of you can't take it for granted that like people can like even like bear one another, like kind of the way that people are, like we can be very difficult to live with. Like it can be very difficult for us to like live with one another and like to live with ourselves. And then I think that there is actually something affirmative about kind of remembering like we're vulnerable, like we have these frailties, like these needs that like we can't really escape, like we sort of have these physical limits and like these emotional limits, and then I think it becomes also kind of quite a moving document of like nonetheless like we'll live with one another, like that's all there is.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.